Hey y'all, it's Allie. Today I want to talk to you about some mistakes I made when I was starting out tarot and then give you some advice that will hopefully help you as you're starting your tarot journey. So my first bit of advice for you is to start with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and just buy yourself an inexpensive copy of the Rider-Waite-Smith. Don't complicate things. It's actually going to be a lot easier for you to find resources if you start with the Rider-Waite-Smith, because even though it's not the first deck or the original deck like a lot of beginners think it is the iconic deck. And so you will have a lot more resources available to you if you just start with the Rider-Waite-Smith and then move on to another deck that's maybe based on the Rider-Waite-Smith but has a different art style later on. When I picked out my first tarot deck in the 90s, there were not a lot of options at my local Borders bookstore. If you know, you know. There was a piss yellow copy of the Rider-Waite-Smith, and it was so yellow and so ugly. Even though it was the iconic tarot deck, I was like, there is no way I'm starting with the Rider-Waite-Smith. My friends even told me, you should start with the Rider-Waite-Smith. It's got all of the best resources online. You can go to a GeoCities website, I know, and find out all kinds of stuff about the meanings and that kind of thing. And I was just like, no, it is so ugly. I am not buying that. And so instead, I bought myself the Aquarian Tarot. Not because it was the deck that I wanted, but because of the few decks that were available to me at the time. It was the best as far as I was concerned. It had a much cooler palette. The characters in the cards have kind of soft facial expressions. It's got this Art Nouveau style to it that really appealed to me. And it's based on the images in the Rider-Waite-Smith, so I thought, what's the difference? I'll just get this prettier deck and I can still learn using the same resources that I would have for the Rider-Waite-Smith. What made the Aquarian Tarot difficult for me to use, even though it was very attractive, is that the artist chose to zoom in really close to the figures, and it's difficult to tell who they are or what they're doing. The way Pamela Coleman Smith, the illustrator who made the Rider-Waite-Smith images, the way she chose to illustrate the cards was to show the figures in full body. Either they are sitting and they're surrounded by objects that are symbolic, or they're in the middle of some kind of action. Either way, you can look at what's on the card and interpret what's happening or who that person is. What was difficult for me about the Aquarian Tarot was because it was cropped in so close to the figures' faces, you often couldn't tell what the characters were doing or who they even were. And it made it really frustrating for me to learn, even though I had some resources available to me online. And so looking back, I wish I had just bought that piss yellow copy of the Rider-Waite-Smith. Yes, it was an ugly version of the deck, but it would have been so much easier to figure out how to interpret the images if I just worked with the original artwork instead of trying to interpret a second layer of interpretation by reading another artist's interpretation of the original artist's interpretation of the cards. It just complicated things too much. Now, we're in a really good place as far as finding copies of the Rider-Waite-Smith that are not only inexpensive, but are also way more attractive than what was being printed in the 90s. There are a lot of better options out there today, and I would say just find a Rider-Waite-Smith that's not going to break the bank and start practicing with it. There is a caveat, of course. Just to cover all of my bases, maybe you're not excited by the Rider-Waite-Smith system at all. That's okay. You could start with the Toth system you would especially like this if you're already into ceremonial magic and Western esotericism, or if you're already familiar with the work of Aleister Crowley. You probably already know about this deck in that case. And if you like a lot of really deep study, then the Thoth Tarot might be a really good place for you to start. The images are really beautiful, and there are other versions of the Thoth as well that you could get into and study as well. So it wouldn't be like you were shortchanging yourself if you started with the Thoth system at all. Also, if you're more interested in working with archetypes and numerology, I would suggest starting with the Tarot de Marseille. A lot of really good readers got their start with the Tarot de Marseille, and I love that deck. I get really beautiful, direct readings from it because you go more by the suits and the numbers instead of needing a full scene on each card. And sometimes it kind of strips away an extra element of interpretation and gives me a more direct reading. So either of those would be really good options as well. But for me personally, as a 17-year-old with birthday money, I knew that what I wanted was the Rider-Waite-Smith. And so that's what I'm recommending, just because it's the iconic deck that you'll see everywhere. All right, so you have your inexpensive copy of the Rider-Waite-Smith. Well, what do you do now? My suggestion is you make it work smarter for you by turning it into a study deck. And what I mean by this is you should take a Sharpie and you should write on the cards. You should write keywords. You should write astrological correspondences. You should write the elements on the cards. Anything that you are coming in contact with when you're online and you're looking at different resources or whatever books you're looking at, you should circle objects and write next to it what that object symbolizes, things like that. Treat it like a textbook instead of like a precious object, because even though you can make notes in a journal or on your phone, which honestly I do recommend that you do that, but when you do that, you have to flip through your notes, you have to scroll through your phone, you basically have to step back from the reading while in the middle of the reading to look that stuff up. And what I would suggest is that you just start writing things on the cards. That way you don't have to take that extra step back in the middle of a reading to figure out how to interpret the cards. So much of interpretation is actually making connections between the cards or connecting the cards to experiences in your own life. And it's a lot easier to do that if you've already taken notes on the cards and you don't have to flip through books or journals or notes in order to find the resources you need to help you with that interpretation as you're starting out. Now, if you are absolutely cringing at the idea of writing on your tarot cards, I get it, I understand, but think about it this way. The cards aren't inherently precious because they're tarot cards. They are precious because you use them. And any deck that you use frequently is going to feel like a sacred object to you. And I would also argue that by modifying the deck, you're actually making it more unique and you're making it more yours, more sacred, more precious. If you think about it, the Rider-Waite-Smith is a mass-produced deck. The reason it's iconic is because you see those images everywhere. And so anything you're doing to the deck that changes it, it really makes it unique to you and more yours. So that might be writing keywords on the card. It might also be something like cutting the borders off of the cards. And that way, when you put the cards down next to each other and line them up, they make one complete picture together instead of separate individual scenes. Or you may want to put glitter on the cards or use a gold pen on certain elements so that parts of the cards that you want to stand out just pop out at you while you're doing the reading, and that can kind of shift how you interpret them as you go on. So if the idea of writing on the cards really bothers you, think of it more as modifying the deck to make it more your own, so it's not just the mass-produced deck that everybody else has. Besides, this is one inexpensive deck. It's not like you can't replace it with something fancier later on. If I wanted to get into tarot study today, I would allow myself to have the pretty deck that I had my eye on, in addition to the inexpensive Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And this is why. One of the biggest mistakes I made in my tarot study was thinking that I could only have one deck, and that this was going to be the only deck I had for my entire life. And that really held me back because like I said before, I did not immediately have an easy time reading with my first deck. I played around with that tarot deck for about a year, and then I got frustrated and I just put it away. I decided that because I couldn't read with that one deck, then tarot just wasn't for me. And it wasn't until 10 years later that I actually allowed myself to buy another tarot deck and try again. When I bought my first tarot deck, there just weren't a whole lot of options. Everything was mass-produced, but it was also difficult to find. We weren't living in this time like we are now, where the tarot has been reinterpreted by so many artists, and sometimes independent artists who've maybe developed their deck and then put it out through Kickstarter, or they sell it on Etsy. And so what I would recommend is get yourself that Rider-Waite-Smith deck that you're going to use as your study deck and write the keywords on it, just like I said. But while you're learning with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, also keep your eyes open for a deck that the art speaks to you. And maybe it's something that's more appropriate for you once you've reached an intermediate level, but it's still something that you can shuffle through and play around while you're learning with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I think if I'd done that early on, that would have grown me as a reader a lot faster. And that leads me to the last bit of advice I have for you, and that is to take the long view. When I first started reading tarot cards, I wanted to be able to read intuitively immediately. I felt like if I couldn't read intuitively right away, then I was doing something wrong by having to look the meanings up in the books. And I was actually kind of ashamed if I didn't know what a card was the second that I saw it. But the truth is, I still look at the meanings in the books. I have a lot of books, and I like to read through them from time to time because different authors have different takes on the cards. And part of tarot study is reading and experiencing as much as I can and then deciding what works best for me. But that is a long-term process. You're not going to be able to do that immediately. And I'm not saying that it's going to take you 10 years before you can do good readings. I'm just saying it's not going to be like you memorize keywords and then bada boom, you're ready to be a professional tarot reader. It's not like that. It's a long-term process. There's always going to be some people who are better than you. And there's always going to be newbies that you can help along the way. So I would just say embrace the process, because just because you step off the cliff doesn't mean you're ever going to get to the bottom of the chasm. As far as it goes with tarot study, this is something that you could do for the rest of your life. And as soon as one mystery is resolved, another one is going to pop up to take its place. So just sink in and get ready for the ride, because tarot study is something that can be really beneficial to your self-development and growth, and it can be something that you learn from for the rest of your life. And that's it, my sweet maraschino cherry babies. If you liked this one, please let me know. Press the thumb. And if you have any questions I could address in a future video, please leave them in the comments below. And until next time, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.